So today's session will be, we will have a 20 to 30 minutes talk by the Larry Reed to understanding why civil liberties are important and how it can actually lead to the greater human progress. Then followed by Barun Mitra's commentary and on the civil liberties and the human progress. And then we will actually continue with the discussion on how we can actually protect civil liberties better, and how as a community, how we can actually build free society in India and also across the world. And without any delay, I would give a stage to Larry Reed.
Okay, thank you very much, Venkatesh, and thanks also to the Swatantrata Center and to my old friend Barun Mitra. It's great to see you both, and thanks to all the listeners who have tuned in today or who may watch this at a later date. Sorry for the problem here on the face. I hope it won't be distracting. It's just a little bit of surgery from a few days ago. It'll clear up by the time I'm on your program the next time, whenever that may be. Well, it's an honor to be with you and to talk about the importance of civil liberties. I'd like to begin by saying a few words about the importance of liberty as a whole. Civil liberties, of course, being a part of that. Liberties also include political liberties, the right to have some say in who your government is, the right to be a part of it if people so choose to elect you. Also, we have religious liberties that are very important, freedom of worship, as well as economic liberties that are often glossed over or forgotten, even by those who claim to be friends of liberty. Those are all very important components of liberty in general. Civil liberties in particular, just like the other ones, are inseparable from liberty as a whole. And so my first point is to understand or suggest that we should understand that an assault on any category of liberty is an assault on all categories of liberty. And why do I say that? Historically, there has been a tendency for, as Thomas Jefferson himself once said, for government to grow and for liberty to shrink. There are plenty of people in every part of the world who would be happy to take away the liberties of other people to serve their own interests of power if they think they could get away with it. And they usually don't say, well, I'm just going to take away some liberty and leave the others intact, because each time they take some liberties, it tends to create a problem, even a crisis quite often, that then leads them further down the path to tyranny to restrict the remaining liberties. So it's important for people who believe in liberty in all its components to make a firm stand against an assault on any part of it, because once you let the behemoth of big government inside the walls, it will work inside to take down the rest of the walls. And so it's hard for me to say that any category of liberty is more important than another. They're all equally important and all should be vigorously defended. If you look throughout history, you'll find that so many people, tragically, this is true of Americans today, a country that is known worldwide as having been founded on principles of liberty, but so many Americans today have come to take for granted what liberties they have or that still remain. Time and again, you'll find historically that a generation arises that is willing to speak truth to power, to put even their lives on the line, to fight for liberty. They attain it, and then maybe throughout their lifetimes, they remain faithful to it and ever vigilant against all encroachments upon it. But then succeeding generations come to take it for granted. And then the people who don't have such dedication to liberty are more interested in things like personal power and notoriety for themselves. They begin to sell the rest of the public some very harmful ideologies that serve the interests of those power-seeking people, but that must come at the expense of the liberties of everyone else. And that's the situation in which we find ourselves in America today. We have to constantly remind our fellow Americans not only how special this country has been in the history of the world and in the history of liberty in particular, we also have to remind them just how rare true liberty is in all of its forms throughout history. I don't know that anybody has ever tried to calculate, what portion, what percentage of the people who have lived on this planet have lived in a considerable degree of liberty. Needless to say, that would be difficult to be precise with, because liberty is often lost in stages, not all at once. And there comes a point with its loss that you can say, well, we no longer have it, and what remains will soon be taken away. But I think it's a fair general statement to point out that the vast majority, probably 90% or more of all the people who have ever lived on this planet have lived not in liberty, but under some form of coercion, nonstop, most, if not all of their lives. They've lived as serfs or slaves, or in various systems in which the individual has to live in constant fear that those with political power may snuff them out. They have to live in constant fear that something they might say could lead to imprisonment or intimidation or even death. So liberty is pretty rare. Most people who have ever lived have not enjoyed it. And when it has come about, it's almost always because there first is a growth of ideas across the public. I don't think it can emerge simply because a tiny handful of people believe in it and understand it. It has to emerge with a growing and substantial consensus. Ordinary people from top to bottom and all income levels, all occupations, for one reason or another, must be stirred to the importance of liberty and the vitality of struggling on its behalf. And that's the way it's typically been won historically. But it is a rare thing. We should never think of it as automatic. It's not guaranteed. Just because you are relatively free doesn't mean that your children or their children will be automatically free. President Ronald Reagan stated so eloquently, and I have to paraphrase, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he pointed out that liberty is always within one generation away of being extinct. Because if people don't, it's not automatic. If people don't believe it and practice it, and if they're not willing to do some heroic things on its behalf, the world being a dangerous place with people who would be happy to take your liberty will smother and suffocate those liberties. So that's how important it is. In fact, in another sense, let me point out that liberty is critically important. It's rare. That's my first major point, that you have to fight for it. But it's also important because it's for what we were made. Regardless of your theory of how human beings came into existence, which I admit is a spiritual or religious matter to a very large extent, or others might say, no, it's not, it's purely scientific, whichever, you have to acknowledge that we're a pretty special and unique species of entity. We are unique, each and every one of us. No two people who've ever lived have been precisely the same in every way. No person has ever lived twice, as far as we know. That we are so special and so unique that when any of us pass away, the world has lost a unique combination. It has lost something that will not be replicated. If that's the case, if we are not a fleet of robots programmed at every turn by some central commander, well, that suggests that in order to be fully who we are, to be fully the individual and unique humans that each of us is, we must enjoy considerable freedom. I mean, that's how we know that we're who we are, because we're able to make choices that reflect our values, our ambitions, our goals in life, and our personalities, and so forth. Take just the opposite. If you couldn't do much of anything without being told, if somebody else instructed you with the threat of force behind their edicts, how to conduct yourself, what to say, what to do, where to live, and so forth, well, then you've ceased to be who you were intended to be. You've ceased to be the independent, unique entity that you are. You're not living your life. The other guy is living his life through you. And that, I think, is profoundly anti-human. If that other guy somehow has the right to live his life through you, to make you bow to his bidding, well, then we should be asking ourselves, well, why does he get to do that? What makes him so special? Why don't I have that same right to tell him what to do? Of course, nobody has that right, and no one should be subjected to that kind of authoritarian behavior unless he, through his own actions, forfeits his liberty by threatening or actually doing harm to the lives, the property, the choices, the contracts of other people. So liberty is pretty critical stuff. I mean, it's what makes us who we are, and without it, we're both not free and not truly the unique individuals that we were created to be. Now, in America, civil liberties aren't something we simply said 250 years ago, we're all for them now, we're going to have them, but we don't have to write anything down. In fact, the single best codification of civil liberties in our country shows up in the form of the Bill of Rights to the US Constitution. Now, I know that most of the audience today is not from America, and so you may at first think, well, what relevance does this have to me halfway around the world? Whether your country has or someday might have something like the Bill of Rights, I think we can all, regardless of where we're from, appreciate the spirit behind the Bill of Rights because it was so unique in the history of the world. To give you some historical context, America, of course, fought a war against its mother country, Great Britain, which by the early 1780s was successful, and that was a remarkable feat. The Second Continental Congress, which was the governing body through the war and the early years thereafter, adopted a document called the Articles of Confederation, which was sort of the constitution, you might say, of its time. It wasn't called that, it was called the Articles of Confederation. But by the late 1780s, there were people who thought that they were inadequate. Now that's another debate, and I don't want to get into that today. I have great respect for those who thought that the articles could have been made to work just fine and that we didn't need a constitution, but that's not what prevailed. By the late 1780s, there was some kind of consensus, at least among those who thought about proper governance, that the articles should be changed and we needed a new document. And they drafted one in Philadelphia in 1787, and it became known as the Constitution. Now, in the debate over the adoption of the Constitution, there arose the matter of, does this document go far enough to guarantee and protect basic civil and other liberties? And the so-called anti-federalists made a pretty strong case that no, it doesn't go far enough. We really need to put some more stuff in it that will guarantee that government will not grow beyond its bounds, will not do things that are destructive of liberty. And out of that sentiment came the Bill of Rights. James Madison, who was ultimately our fourth president and a prime architect of the Constitution, at first opposed the addition of a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. And one of his concerns was, if we put in the document, into the Constitution, specific enumerated rights, we run the danger that people will in the future say, well, okay, here's something that people are claiming to be a right, but it really isn't because it's not in expressly named in the Constitution. And Madison said that would be actually an open door to tyranny. We don't want to specify certain rights to the point where people say those are the only ones we have, and anything else is just a claim that doesn't have validity in the Constitution. So there was a great debate over that. And the end result was that the Constitution itself might not have been ratified. There is a good case to be made that it wouldn't have, without the assurance that a Bill of Rights would ultimately be included. So when the Constitution was sent out to the states for ratification, the states began to ratify it with the assurance that it would include a Bill of Rights. And if it ultimately didn't, I suppose some of those states would have said, okay, we're going to rescind our ratification. We're not going to ignore it. So the Bill of Rights became pivotal to the passage of the Constitution itself. And probably everybody's favorite, if you could ask people who really think about these things, what's your favorite Bill of Rights component? These took the form, by the way, of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They were adopted, incidentally, on December 15, 1791. That makes next Wednesday Bill of Rights Day, you might say. It's not an official holiday. Most Americans, unfortunately, will let the day pass without even noting it or remembering its significance. But those of us who believe very strongly in the importance of the Bill of Rights would love to see the American people annually celebrate this day, the day that the entire Bill of Rights, all 10 amendments, were adopted as part of the Constitution. The First Amendment is probably the best known, and as I say, maybe a lot of people's favorites. And here's how it reads. Think of how sweeping this is. It says, Congress shall make no law. Now it's pretty clear, isn't it? It doesn't say Congress shall make some law. It doesn't say Congress shall occasionally make law. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That was the order of the day in those times when governments all across Europe had come to dominate the church establishments, even subsidizing the chosen church, even requiring church attendance, and declaring that the state and church were one. But the First Amendment here says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I'm glad they added that second part, because not establishing a formal state-sanctioned religion really doesn't go far enough. You want to be sure that Congress also, or government also, does not restrict the people's right to independently, on their own, freely exercise the faith of their choice, so long as they do no harm to others. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. I mean, I look at those words all these decades afterwards and say to myself, wow, how rare something like this is in the foundation of the nations of world history. It was the intent of the founders to make it plain that that government can go so far and do certain things, but it shall go no further. It shall not restrict freedoms of speech and press. Now, keep in mind, this is aimed at government. And although government is the greatest single violator in history of individual liberties, civil, political, and economic, it's not the only violator. I would argue that even today in the private sector, you have people and entities, academia, media, business, you name it, who are engaged in this politically correct woke movement that is having a very stifling effect on civil liberties. It's not necessarily backed up, at least not in every case, by any force of government, but it has the effect through their insistence that certain speech be used and certain speech not be used because it's offensive. It has the effect of stifling free inquiry and free thought. And we need more discussion in America and perhaps around the world about how freedoms of speech and press and assembly can be violated not just by government, but by harmful, oppressive, intimidating ideologies as well. But the Bill of Rights First Amendment was aimed at keeping government out of your brain, out of your church, and off your property, and so forth. That's pretty important. Now, I know that I should say a few more words about the other aspects of the Bill of Rights before citing a few interesting observations from others, and then ending my portion of the program here. But we have 10 amendments total in the Bill of Rights. They're aimed, in many cases, towards the protection of what we call civil liberties. But they also guarantee the right to hold property, the right to keep and bear arms. That's the Second Amendment that is unfortunately under assault every day. But the Supreme Court so far has remained pretty faithful to that in its interpretation. We have protections in the Bill of Rights from unreasonable search and seizure by government. We have protections against self-incrimination in a court of law. We have the expressed right to a speedy and impartial trial by jury and representation by counsel. And then the last two amendments, the 9th and the 10th, I think are worthy of note because they're often forgotten, and yet they are very important. The 9th Amendment declares that rights that are enumerated in the Constitution, quote, shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That's how our founding fathers dealt with that issue I mentioned earlier. They said, okay, now that we've specified certain rights, we don't want you to think that that means those are the only ones you have. And then the 10th Amendment affirms our system of federalism, the relationship between the federal government and the states. Why is this important? Well, the founding fathers clearly understood. They were very knowledgeable men and women, founding mothers as well, who understood world history, and they recognized that the single greatest danger to liberty is the concentration of power in the hands of the state. They knew that it was intoxicating. Personally, I would argue that there is no motivation more powerfully intoxicating, more destructive than a desire for control, for power, to push people around, take their stuff, tell them what to do, live your life through them as if they were your slaves. That's an ever-present danger in the history of humanity. And so they thought that part of the business of preventing that stuff from getting hold was to disperse power so it doesn't get concentrated in the hands of one entity or one person. And so that's why they felt very strongly about the importance of the states. They wanted the states to have a significant degree of sovereignty. That's part of the process of dispersing power. They liked the idea of each state being its own laboratory, you might say, free to try certain things without the federal government suppressing them at every turn. So the 10th Amendment basically says the following: the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. In other words, if a question arises about what the federal government can or can't do, the automatic default position is not a green light for Washington. If there is a default position, it is that, well, that then belongs to the states and to the people. There's no automatic assumption that the federal government has every right or power that it may claim simply because it's not expressed in the Constitution. So over the years, not just since the Bill of Rights was adopted, we've had some great observations about civil and other forms of liberty And I'd like to just share a few, and then I think my time is probably up, and we go to a discussion with Barun. But even years before, decades before the debates in the Constitutional Convention in the 1780s in America, you had people like John Milton in England saying this in his great tract called Areopagitica, which was a defense of freedom of the press against government censorship. He said, "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties." Think of that. Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties. I think John Milton understood that this business of freedom to think and to say, to speak, is so important that if it's lost, probably no other freedom is going to be retained or will matter very much, because it's through the business of speech and thought and that we express ourselves, that we come up with competing ideas for the established status quo. This is how we innovate and improve and learn from our mistakes. Progress stops the moment you tell people you can't say or speak your mind. And Milton understood the critical importance of that civil liberty. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist in American history, who was born a slave, said this: "Liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. That of all rights is the dread of tyrants. It is the right which they first of all strike down. They know its power. Thrones, dominions, principalities, and powers founded in injustice and wrong are sure to tremble if men are allowed to reason of righteousness, temperance, and of a judgment to come in their presence. Slavery cannot tolerate free speech." George Orwell, the author of Animal Farm in 1984, certainly those books, 1984 especially, make you shiver when you consider the crushing of a person's conscience and ability to speak freely as you read that book. He said, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear." I mean, isn't that indisputable? If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear. And Albert Einstein, in this following quote, expressed the importance of a general understanding and commitment to the spirit of civil liberty in order for civil liberty to survive. He put it this way: "Laws alone cannot secure freedom of expression. In order that every man may present his views without penalty, there must be a spirit of tolerance in the entire population." And finally, I'll leave you with a quote from America's founding president, George Washington. He said, "If freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter." Those are powerful quotes in support of civil liberty. And I'll end by simply saying we need to make the spirit of those quotations and of what I've said this morning, we need to make those matters of the heart as well as the conscience and of the mind. We need to make the promotion and preservation and the protection of civil liberty something that each of us commits his life to, because otherwise it will be in constant danger and will likely be overturned the first time some emergency arises or some tyrant appears on the scene who wants to take our liberties away for his own selfish benefit. With that, let me say thank you for listening, and I hope I've said enough to prompt a conversation with Barun and perhaps questions from the audience.
Thank you, Larry. I know, interesting and as always inspiring thoughts, particularly going through the Bill of Rights and its bit of its history, because I think it's very important to remember that, and even I hadn't really thought about it except the date, 1791 as the Bill of Rights. So thank you very much for reminding us of how it happened, and particularly the ninth, that the rights enumerated should not be seen as the only ones, and that it's open for the new rights to come in as and when. Yeah, so I think that's really quite interesting, because Indian Constitution did adopt at least the theme of much of the Bill of Rights, but this part is generally not there. And contrary to the US one, where you said that Congress shall make no laws, in our Constitution, we have specific provision for the government to make laws to reasonably restrict whatever freedom or rights there might be. Yeah, so that's quite a interesting contrast for me. But the first question that came to my mind is, while I completely agree that we need to look at liberty in its entirety as a whole, and not in pieces and pick up as we choose fit. And I also agree that tyrants find it quite easy to take away liberty, typically not in one go, but in small slices and pieces. And the liberty is lost in 1,000 cuts.
Yes.
Therefore, the question is, how, as you said in America today, and I think across the world, in India as well, freedoms and liberties are quite compartmentalized.
Yes.
Civil rights and human rights are generally in one bracket, and the economic freedoms are in another bracket. So the question is, how did we end up segregating the rights or the freedoms in these kind of compartments instead of looking at them as a whole?
Yes, that's a great question, Barun. And perhaps if we all understood the proper answer to that, we would then be able to do a better job defending all of our liberties. I think that with time, after the adoption of the Constitution, when people's minds were so focused on creating a new government that would protect the liberties that they fought for, with time, our memories of what it was we fought for, and that it was one big ball of wax, and that the enemy was concentrated power, that began to fade. And what took over time is particular ideologies and agendas that may have been sympathetic to some parts of freedom, but not others. And the importance of thinking of freedom as one ball of wax that comes under assault if any part of it is assaulted, that faded away. So people began to think, well, we have a problem here. We have economic inequality. And so we need to do something about that. And if somebody said, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Are you talking about confiscatory taxation of the rich, for instance? Opponents proponents of that philosophy may have said, well, we need to move in that direction, but we still are in favor of other freedoms like speech and press and assembly and so forth, which suggests that people were beginning to lose their understanding that an assault on one part of liberty is an assault on them all, and that usually the door is open to those further assaults when you let the assaulter in the first place. So that suggests our understanding of liberty just began to be overcome by other interests, other concerns, other ideologies, other selfish desires, such as to control other people. And then, the economic liberty that is part of that big picture, that has probably been the easiest for statists or socialists, people who believe in empowering government more. That's probably been the easiest for them to assault. And the way they've done that, of course, is to first vilify people who achieve success in the marketplace. Sometimes there are people who achieve success because they've done it wrongly. They've used their political connections to get special favors, but they're a relatively small minority. But the economic freedom component, economic liberty, has been the easiest for statists to assault, because they say, well, you don't want to be greedy, and we want to be more equal. We want to help the poor. I mean, that's a very seductive and alluring set of suggestions. And it takes real homework to respond to. So liberty typically is diminished historically, not by armed invasion. That happens, of course, and then it may all go overnight. But most of the time, as you noted, liberty is assaulted one piece at a time. But the thing we should most understand of that is that once that process begins, it makes each remaining component of liberty harder to preserve, because those assaulting liberty are not content to take some. When they get what they want, they'll go for more.
Yeah, that's true on one side. I think, because I've been grappling with this question for quite some time, for over a decade now, that how have we fragmented? And the other side of it is, I think, and from my own experience, that in the first 20 years of my engagement in the public policy and liberty discourse, I would think that 90% of our attention was on the economic sphere.
Yeah.
And for one reason or the other, we contributed to this division that economic sphere is distinguished and completely separate from the civil and the political side.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that had been, on the policy side, I think that had been a huge mistake.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. It's just think of it this way. This is a stark analogy that might ring a bell in people's minds, but let's suppose the government decides with a consensus of the people that economic liberty is not very important, and that it should give way to all kinds of ambitious projects, programs, spending, and regulations that the government wants to impose. And so that over the long term, with the erosion of economic freedom, you then have the concentration of economic power in the hands of those making the regulations. It's hard to imagine that freedoms of speech and press and assembly will remain intact if the means of production, if the commanding heights of the economy are in the control of the government. It really is a natural thing to assume that if your economic liberties are taken away, it gives the government substantial advantage, substantial power to assault the remaining liberties.
That's true, but I think because of this segregation, there has been a cultural and an intellectual hierarchy,
mm-hmm.
where the economic aspects have been downgraded to technical issues and expertise and matters of policy, where civil and political issues are looked upon, even now to a large extent, as a question of morality.
Mm-hmm.
That human rights is something fundamental, whereas economic freedom is just incidental.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this has a long history, as far as I can see, perhaps from the late 1980s. The seeds were there, and what we see as political polarization today is actually a flowering of those seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm grappling with the idea of how do we reintegrate the idea of liberty as a whole, rather than allow these compartments to continue. And I can see, like I said, I can see from my side, from being involved in more than 20 years in actively trying to promote the ideas of economic liberty, I can count on fingertips. And I perhaps was one of the few who even considered the civil and the human rights to be an integral part.
Yeah.
Most people I came across in India and abroad, the focus was primarily on how to win a policy victory which might increase the scope for economic freedom, with a complete silence and disregard for various other forms of injustices and discrimination that prevail. And I think that has been a huge error. And we've ceded the moral high ground.
Yes.
And which is why I think what you said, that why do we think redistributive policies have such a wider appeal? You don't see it on the streets. India is one of the most unequal countries and one of the poorer countries in the world today. The disparity between the rich and the poor is much wider than in most other places. We have billionaires as many, and the number of poor at the bottom.
Yeah.
Yet we rarely see, or we hardly ever see, the poor rushing to take away stuff from the millionaires and the billionaires. And I don't think it is only because of fear of the law.
Yeah.
Because the law is quite weak in India. Therefore, we really need to completely rethink that there's a fatal flaw among many of us who argued the case for liberty and got restricted to the economic aspects. We need to really rethink how we can integrate the civil and the political side. And that's the challenge that we must first recognize. And once we begin to recognize it, then perhaps we'll be able to figure out how to deal with it, because it has a very practical significance. The practical significance is in the polarization that we see. That division in society today is so deep in yours and mine that it's almost impossible to have a meaningful discourse across the ideological divide. And the ideological divide is not an accident. This divide is a consequence of the past segregation of economic on one side and the civil political on the other side that has been perpetuated over the last 3-4 decades now.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Barun. And this is why, and I'm not claiming that this is the best or certainly not the only way to address this, but I have for a number of years felt that one very good way to address this is to appeal to a person on the basis of character. Try to point out to people that, the one thing that you have the most control over, no matter where you live, is your personal character. Now, you can complain that your government doesn't give you much freedom and you can't do this, you can't do that. That's very unfortunate. We should work to change that. But you still have a lot of control over your personal character. And in fact, by the end of your life, you will be able to look back and say that your character was overwhelmingly the result of decisions you made, the kind of life you chose to live. And hopefully you'll be able to look back and say, I made as many of the right decisions as I possibly could. And so I have a clear conscience as I now go on to my reward. And part of a solid character is recognizing when force is applicable and proper and when force is not. Because that's what all this discussion about policy and principle really comes down to. How do you want to accomplish things in the world that you think are good? Do you want to accomplish them by persuasion, by example, by living the life yourself that you profess others should live so that you can be a model thereby? Or do you want to employ the use of the police, the force of government, to shape and mold and push people around? I think the fundamental immorality of the second option there is something we don't make plain enough to people that we should really be stressing to them that, you don't want to go through your life wasting it by demanding that government push other people around, take their stuff, give you this and so forth. Because at some point, if you've got a conscience, you're going to look back and say, wow, what a lousy way to live. I'm sure glad there weren't lots of other people trying to do that to me. So maybe character and its importance is one thing we underemphasize. You look at American history, for most of the first 100 years, we didn't have think tanks. We had a few philosophers, but not too many people had the time to read philosophy. And yet we, generally speaking, kept our liberties intact. In fact, we even engaged in a crusade to extend liberty to people to whom it had been denied. The Civil War was the result of that. Well, how were we able to keep those liberties relatively intact and even extend some without anybody at the top commanding it, without any central authority telling us to? It was largely because we were a people of character. We really thought, more than we do today, that what we choose to do is what makes our future. And we didn't look to politicians to make our future for us. And we were free because we believed it ourselves. And there were lines that we would not cross because that would suggest to us that we're no longer people of character. We've lost that today. Now it's sort of like, well, anything goes. If it gives me some advantage or helps this guy for the moment, let's do it. Even a smash and grab robbery is okay if the thieves use the loot for the right purposes. I mean, maybe we're not yet there, but we're headed in that direction, unfortunately, because we've lost that sense of what morality and personal character are all about.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that I kind of came through from a very different route, because after all, I don't live in America and I'm an Indian and have been here for most of my life. Over the last 10 years, I've been trying to rediscover why this gap and what could be the ways of narrowing it. And one part of that rediscovery had been Gandhi, the Indian freedom fighter who led the freedom independence movement in the first half of the 20th century. And something that he said has stayed in my mind, and particularly in the context of what you said about how do we limit the scope of the state by realizing the force it carries, and therefore the legitimacy and limits of that force, and the need to have a legitimacy and the limit on that force. And therefore, and Gandhi to me is particularly interesting because unlike the Americas, Gandhi didn't come through the right from the path of the rights. Mm-hmm. He largely came from the path of duties. And that, I think, is what you are saying when you are talking of character. Mm. And I kind of defined it as rights are our obligation to others. Mm. Duties are our obligations to ourselves. And that's why when you said that character is something that is in our hand, that it is a result of our choices and decisions that we have made, is exactly because we think those are the right calls that we have made, and those are the duty, and making those right calls is the fundamental duty. And this to me was pretty important because Gandhi was dealing at a time when the power of the state, particularly the imperial state, was unlimited.
Yes.
The rule of law applied, but only applied in kind of sporadic manner. Therefore, for Gandhi, it was extremely important to underscore that what is the state that we call upon to do or get things done. And therefore, Gandhi said that every action of the state is a manifestation of violence. Yeah. And that is the reason why we need to restrain and restrict the state to the bare minimum. Because the more we expand the state, the more we'll contribute to normalizing violence in society. And the paradox is that by expanding the language of rights, that today, what you said as part of the American history, that the rights were all restrictions on the state, that the Congress shall pass no law. Today, we think of any right which the Congress passes a law on.
Yeah.
So in your country and mine, the legislature and the government has turned the language of rights upside down. So rights can now be created at public expense by the state by just creating a legislation giving rights for various things, ignoring that all those rights are coming with the barrel of the gun endorsing it.
Yes.
Rather than the other way around. So I think this is where I think what you said, I didn't know what you are going to say today, but that you focused on character kind of resonated in my mind, this distinction between rights and duties that Gandhi tried to do very sharply.
Yes. Oh, I like your emphasis on the word duty, Barun, and I think we would be in agreement. You tell me if we are, if I would say that a person having a duty does not imply that government must force him to do it. In other words, I'll give you an example. I think it's fair to say, although you have a right not to use your talents, your skills, and your abilities and just be a couch potato, you have a right in a free society not to just to sit around and do nothing, but you have a duty as an individual human being, unique and possessed with certain skills and abilities. You have a duty to grow, to hatch, you might say, as a bird does. You have a duty to use your talents and abilities to the best that you can. So a duty becomes an aspect of a person's character, whether or not he fulfills that duty. But we don't have the government standing over him saying, okay, if you don't do your duty, if you don't use your talents the way I think you should, then there will be penalties. Would you agree?
Yeah, completely. I mean, duty, if it is to have any legitimacy or any moral validity, it has to be by choice.
Yeah.
It has to be by choice. It cannot be forced. In fact, this is another of the paradoxes in language that we encounter, which comes out in the US Constitution and the preamble or the Declaration pretty starkly. The Declaration talks of the inalienable rights, right? That the rights are inalienable, whereas the Constitution specifies the rights and qualifies it by saying that the Congress shall make no laws, which means that the rights, and which is what I said in another way, that is, rights to be rights cannot be at the expense of others.
Yes.
And which is why our obligation, when we talk of right, we acknowledging our obligation towards others, that we do not violate the rights of others. Yeah. But when we are talking of duties, we are talking of our obligation to ourselves to do what's right, to do what's the right thing to do, what's the correct thing to do, what's the moral thing to do. So I think that distinction has been grossly erased over the last quite a few decades now, and I think it's going to be a struggle to try to figure out how to claw and get the idea of liberty in a more holistic manner than what we have got today.
Well, Barun, maybe based on our discussion here today, you've given me this idea. Maybe what we need is a universal Bill of Duties, not just an American Bill of Rights, but a universal, applicable everywhere in the world to anybody, a Bill of Duties. Somebody ought to write that up, and I nominate you if you want to do it.
The problem is that then it will become legalized. There's a very interesting story that when the Universal Human Rights Declaration was being drafted, someone approached Gandhi saying, "What do you think of this?" He said, "I don't think of it at all, because I would prefer what you said, a bill of duties, not to be enforced by the state, but to be adopted by every individual."
Well, maybe the first of the points in such a bill of duties ought to be that no government shall make any law forcibly imposing the following duties upon its people. Sort of a Congress shall make no law kind of provision.
Perhaps it'll be interesting exercise to attempt. But I'm glad we found such an area, and I'm surprised because I was not thinking of that this kind of an issue will come up in the discussion today. But we are already past 8, and I don't know where Venkatesh is. So I think we have taken your 1 hour that you had allocated. So Venkatesh.
Well, it's been wonderful. And there, Venkatesh, we see you now.
Yeah, honestly, I didn't actually expected this sort of discussion. I mean, like our past discussions was largely focused on India and Indian context, and largely we actually look around what kind of policies and what kind of practices we been actually doing right or wrong in India, and I think this discussion actually took it in a level where we can actually see why, I mean, how we can actually should approach civil liberties or a liberty as a whole, and why we should actually look, actually bring together various aspects of it. And at Swatantrata, we also have a similar version of when we actually defending the liberty, even though we actually gave more importance working in and around promoting economic freedom, but we recognize, we identify that we cannot actually compartmentalize the various aspects of liberty, and by doing so, we are actually aligning somehow with the people who may not actually agree with the other aspects of the liberty we are actually talking, and it actually doing a way more damage as a whole. As one of you actually mentioned, they actually come for one aspect of the liberties first, then they will actually come after the others, the one way or other. So I also wanted to remember one quote. It's not exactly the same. Alexander McKibben of SFL founder was actually saying in one of the conferences was, liberty doesn't come in pieces. We have to defend it as a whole at every time. So I think with the spirit, we also try to bring that together, how we can actually reclaim ideas of liberalism from the left and right. And last year, we actually hosted a conference on the same theme where Larry was also spoken there on the personal character and why it is actually important for liberty movement. And this discussion is actually very, very interesting, and definitely I have to rewatch it because I'm also parallelly doing some logistical stuff. And but thank you so much, Larry, for actually giving your time, and also the Barunji for actually accepting in a very very, very less time, and also agreeing to actually join for the session. And thank you so much. And also, I would like to thank Students for Liberty, who is actually supporting our events and regularly, and also join as a partner for this session. And okay, I saw the Kumar on the call, so I thought to ask if he wanted to give a quick comment, but I think he dropped. And thank you so much, and we looking forward to have you both and our future projects and work together and building free and prosperous India and the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Venkatesh. Thank you, Barun. I hope one of these days to see you in India. It's on my list.
Thank you, Larry. It was great, and it will be really great if you could come to India, and hopefully the COVID episode will be over soon so that our in-person meetings can resume. So yeah, thank you very much for joining in this discussion, and I enjoyed it.